The sky above the Philippine Sea was turning black with smoke when the American pilot realized he had made a fatal mistake. 3 Japanese Zero fighters were already behind him. 2 more were climbing from below. His engine temperature was rising fast. Oil splattered across the inside of the canopy, and at 14,000 feet, Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Kane suddenly did something no American flight instructor would ever recommend in the middle of a dogfight. He pulled back the throttle. Hard. His Hellcat slowed violently. The Japanese pilots thought he was surrendering control of the aircraft. What happened next would later become one of the strangest survival stories of the Pacific War. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. June 1944. The Pacific Theater had become a machine that consumed pilots faster than either side could replace them. The United States Navy was pushing west toward the Mariana Islands. Japan knew exactly what that meant. If the Americans captured Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, long-range bombers would finally be able to strike mainland Japan directly. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not allow that to happen, so they prepared everything for one massive counterattack. Aircraft carriers, veteran pilots, dive bombers, Zeros. Nearly every experienced aviator Japan still had left. American intelligence intercepted fragments of radio traffic, but did not fully understand the scale of what was coming. Most U.S. Navy pilots believed they were flying another routine carrier patrol. They were wrong. Among those pilots was 23-year-old Robert Kane from Ohio. Before the war, Kane was not considered exceptional by anyone. He was thin, quiet, obsessed with aircraft manuals, the kind of man who spent evenings reading engineering notes while other cadets drank beer and played cards. At Pensacola flight training, instructors respected his discipline but doubted his instincts. He was too cautious, too analytical, too slow to react. One instructor reportedly wrote that Kane flew like a librarian. That reputation followed him into the Navy, even after earning his wings, even after deployment to the Pacific. Other pilots joked that Kane treated combat like a math problem. And in some ways he did. He memorized aircraft performance charts, turn rates, engine limitations, fuel burn calculations. He knew the exact speed at which a Hellcat became unstable during steep climbs. He knew how Japanese Zeros behaved at low speed versus high speed. Most pilots learned through instinct. Kane learned through observation. That difference would soon save his life. By mid-1944, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat had become America's primary carrier fighter. It was powerful, fast, durable, but heavy, especially compared to the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Zero could turn tighter, climb faster, and react quicker in close combat. American pilots were trained never to engage Zeros in slow-turning fights, use speed, use altitude, hit hard, and escape. That doctrine existed for a reason. Pilots who ignored it usually died. On the morning of June 19th, Kane launched from the deck of the USS Lexington before sunrise. The carrier deck shook beneath the Hellcat's wheels as engines roared in the humid darkness. Mechanics moved through thick exhaust smoke. Signal officers waved glowing batons. One by one, fighters disappeared into the sky. The mission sounded simple: intercept incoming Japanese aircraft before they reached the American fleet. But as Kane climbed above the carrier group, radio chatter began changing tone. Pilots were spotting massive formations. Dozens became hundreds. The horizon itself seemed alive with aircraft. Japanese bombers approached in layered waves protected by swarms of escort fighters. This was no raid. It was an air armada. Years later, American pilots would call the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But at the beginning, nobody was laughing, because the Japanese pilots approaching that morning were still highly dangerous, and many had combat experience stretching back to Pearl Harbor. Kane's squadron climbed toward the incoming formations. Sunlight flashed across canopies, contrails cut through the upper atmosphere. Then the shooting started. Tracer rounds ripped across the sky. Hellcats dove into the Japanese formation head-on. Aircraft exploded instantly. One bomber lost a wing and spiraled downward, trailing fire. Another collided midair with a Zero during evasive maneuvers. The sky became chaos. Kane fired his .650 caliber machine guns into a passing bomber and watched panels tear away from the fuselage. The aircraft rolled inverted and disappeared into clouds below. But moments later, Kane heard shouting through radio static. "Zero's behind you, brake right, brake right." He snapped his Hellcat sideways, just as cannon rounds flashed past his canopy. A Japanese Zero crossed behind him so close Kane could actually see the pilot's goggles. Another Zero appeared above him, then another. Within seconds, Kane realized he had become separated from his squadron. 5 Japanese fighters were now converging on a single American aircraft. The standard response was obvious: dive away at maximum speed. Use the Hellcat's superior durability and engine power. But there was a problem. Kane's engine had already taken damage. A burst of Japanese fire struck the cowling during the initial attack. Oil pressure was dropping. The aircraft vibrated violently every time he increased throttle. If the engine seized during a dive, he would be dead before reaching the ocean. Still, the Japanese fighters continued closing. The first Zero attacked from above. Kane rolled left. Machine gun rounds tore through the edge of his wing. The second attacker came from below. More impacts hammered the Hellcat's fuselage. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel. Inside the cockpit, the air smelled like burned oil and cordite. His oxygen mask filled with the sound of his own breathing. Fast, controlled, but getting heavier. Then came the moment that changed everything. Kane noticed something strange about the Japanese attacks. Every Zero pilot expected him to dive away at high speed. They were positioning for pursuit, predicting American doctrine, predicting American behavior. And suddenly Kane realized the one thing nobody in the sky expected him to do was slow down. Not slightly, violently. The idea sounded insane. A Hellcat was already less maneuverable than a Zero at low speed. Every training manual warned against bleeding energy during combat. But Kane understood something else. Japanese pilots attacking from behind depended on closure speed. They were committing aggressively because they expected him to keep accelerating. If he suddenly reduced throttle, the geometry of the attack would collapse. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and they would adjust. Too late and he would be shot apart. The first Zero lined up directly behind him. Kane could almost feel the pilot preparing to fire. Then he slammed the throttle backward. The Hellcat shuddered. Engine noise dropped instantly. The aircraft decelerated so hard Kane's shoulder harness dug into his chest. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the Japanese formation exploded into confusion. The lead Zero overshot first. Its pilot had committed too much speed. The fighter screamed past Kane's canopy before the Japanese aviator could react. A second Zero nearly collided with the first while trying to avoid impact. A third fighter climbed abruptly to avoid both aircraft. The formation lost cohesion instantly. And suddenly, for the first time in the battle, Kane had space. He rolled underneath the nearest overshooting Zero and fired a burst directly into its belly. The Japanese fighter erupted in flame, but the danger was far from over. 2 more Zeros immediately reversed to attack again. Kane's wingman, Ensign Walter Briggs, watched the entire maneuver from several thousand feet away. At first, Briggs thought Kane had lost control of the aircraft. Then he saw the Zero explode. "Jesus Christ," Briggs reportedly muttered over the radio. Kane pulled into a climbing turn. His damaged engine screamed in protest. Temperature gauges climbed higher. The Hellcat shook violently. One more hard maneuver could tear the aircraft apart, but now the Japanese pilots hesitated. That hesitation mattered, because dogfights often lasted only seconds, and confusion killed faster than bullets. The remaining Zeros regrouped carefully instead of charging recklessly. They had realized the American pilot was not behaving normally. Kane used that hesitation to climb toward a nearby cloud layer. Another Zero attacked cautiously from long range. Machine gun tracers stitched across the sky behind him. Kane waited, then cut throttle again. The Japanese pilot overshot slightly. Not enough for a clean kill, but enough to force separation. Again the geometry broke apart. Again the Japanese pilot lost position. Kane had discovered something terrifyingly simple. The enemy had trained to predict aggressive American escape patterns. By doing the exact opposite, he forced split-second mistakes. And at combat speed, split-second mistakes were fatal. But there was still one enormous problem. His Hellcat was dying. Oil pressure continued falling. Smoke poured from the engine cowling. The aircraft would not survive much longer, and now more Japanese fighters were approaching from the east. Kane checked fuel, checked altitude, checked distance from the American fleet. Too far, much too far. If the engine failed now, he would ditch alone in open ocean surrounded by enemy aircraft. Then radio static cracked through his headset again. Blue leader to all fighters, enemy second wave inbound, multiple bandits approaching your sector. Kane looked up, and his blood ran cold. Because emerging through the sunlight above him was an entirely new formation of Japanese fighters descending directly toward his position. The new wave of Japanese fighters came down out of the sunlight like falling knives. Kane counted at least 7, maybe more. Against a healthy Hellcat, the odds were already terrible. Against a damaged aircraft leaking oil across the canopy, they were almost impossible. The cockpit had become unbearably hot. The engine vibrated through the control stick so violently his hands felt numb. Every few seconds the propeller coughed smoke. The Hellcat was dying one piece at a time. Below him stretched hundreds of miles of Pacific Ocean. No friendly ships nearby. No rescue aircraft. No margin for error. And the Japanese pilots knew it. The first 2 zeros dove immediately. Fast, disciplined, experienced. These were not reckless rookies. The Pacific War had already killed most inexperienced Japanese aviators by 1944. The men attacking Kane now were survivors, pilots who had fought Americans over Guadalcanal, Wake Island, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They understood energy fighting, deflection shooting, ambush angles. One mistake against them usually meant death. Kane rolled hard right as cannon fire ripped through the air behind him. The Hellcat shuddered violently. Warning lights flashed again. More damage. He could smell fuel now. Somewhere behind the cockpit, aviation gasoline was leaking into the fuselage. Another burst struck the tail section. Metal clanged like hammer blows. The entire aircraft yawed sideways. Then came a sound every pilot feared, a sharp metallic crack from inside the engine housing. Kane glanced at the gauges. Oil pressure nearly gone. Cylinder temperature critical. He had minutes left at best, maybe less. Over the radio, Briggs finally reappeared. "Bobby, your engine's smoking bad. You need to dive out now." Dive out. Again, standard doctrine. Use speed. Escape. But Kane already knew the engine would never survive a full-power dive. The Hellcat would seize before he reached safety, and the Japanese pilots knew it too. That was the terrifying part. The enemy fighters had stopped rushing him recklessly. Now they were hunting carefully, patiently, like wolves surrounding a wounded animal. 1 zero climbed high above Kane while 2 others stayed low. Classic trap. Force the American pilot downward into crossfire. Kane's breathing slowed, not from calmness, from concentration, because inside the chaos he noticed another pattern. The Japanese pilots were still expecting him to defend conventionally. Every attack assumed he would preserve speed, preserve altitude, preserve momentum, but his aircraft was already too damaged for conventional survival, which meant the normal rules no longer mattered. And suddenly, Kane made a decision so dangerous that even experienced American pilots later struggled to believe it. Instead of diving away, he intentionally slowed the Hellcat even further. The aircraft was now approaching stall speed. Inside training manuals, this was practically suicide. A fighter near stall speed became unstable. Heavy, sluggish, easy prey. But Kane wasn't trying to outfight the Japanese pilots anymore. He was trying to break their rhythm completely. The first zero committed to attack from above. Kane waited until the very last second. Then he pulled the nose sharply upward while cutting power almost entirely. The Hellcat lurched violently. For one horrifying moment, it felt like the aircraft might simply fall backward out of the sky. The Zero pilot never expected it. He had calculated lead for a fast-moving target, Instead, the American fighter suddenly hung almost motionless in front of him. The Japanese pilot overshot by less than 20 feet. Kane fired instinctively. 650 caliber machine guns erupted together. Tracer fire slammed through the Zero's cockpit and engine. The fighter burst into flame so close Kane could actually feel heat flash across his canopy. The burning aircraft spiraled downward, trailing black smoke into the Pacific. Briggs saw the entire thing from above. "What the hell is he doing?" he shouted over the radio. But Kane barely heard him, because now every Japanese pilot in the area understood something dangerous. The wounded American was improvising, and improvisation terrified experienced combat pilots. Predictable enemies could be trapped. Unpredictable enemies became lethal. Another Zero attacked immediately from Kane's left. This pilot avoided overcommitting. Careful, disciplined. He fired short, controlled bursts while climbing across the Hellcat's flank. Rounds punched through Kane's wing root. Hydraulic pressure dropped instantly. The control stick stiffened in his hands. The aircraft became harder to maneuver. Then the engine coughed again, louder this time. Smoke flooded the cockpit. For a split second, Kane thought the Hellcat was about to catch fire. He looked toward the ocean below, still too high to ditch safely, still too far from American ships. Then came another voice over the radio. "Calm Sharp, Commander Ellis Parker, Squadron Leader. Kane, we're trying to reach your position. Hold on. Hold on." Easy words to say from miles away. But Kane knew they probably wouldn't reach him in time. The Japanese fighters were tightening the circle again. One above, two behind, another climbing underneath. The ocean reflected sunlight upward so brightly it became difficult to track movement. Sweat rolled down Kane's face beneath the oxygen mask. His gloves were slick against the controls, and suddenly the engine power dropped again. The Hellcat slowed dangerously. Japanese pilots immediately sensed weakness. The nearest Zero accelerated straight toward him. Kane watched the attack developing through shattered glass streaked with oil. He could almost predict the pilot's thinking now. The enemy expected panic, expected desperation, expected the American to flee. Instead, Kane performed the same impossible maneuver one more time. He cut throttle completely. The Hellcat practically froze in the sky. The attacking Zero shot forward too fast to correct. For a split second, both pilots were almost side by side, close enough to see faces. The Japanese pilot turned toward Kane in visible shock. Then Kane rolled beneath him and fired upward. The Zero's right wing disintegrated instantly. The aircraft snapped sideways and vanished into cloud below. But the maneuver nearly killed Kane, too. The Hellcat finally entered a partial stall. The nose dropped violently. Altitude disappeared fast. Warning alarms screamed inside the cockpit. For several terrifying seconds, the fighter fell almost uncontrollably toward the ocean. Kane fought the controls desperately. The aircraft shook so hard it felt like the wings might tear off. Then finally the Hellcat recovered. Barely. Only a few thousand feet remained beneath him now. And the Japanese pilots had learned. The next attackers kept more distance. No more reckless overshoots. No more easy mistakes. Kane had surprised them only temporarily. Now they adapted, which meant the advantage was disappearing again. A burst of cannon fire tore through the rear fuselage. Fragments exploded inside the cockpit. One piece sliced across Kane's shoulder. Pain hit instantly. Warm blood soaked into his flight suit. The radio crackled with Briggs shouting warnings. Another Zero diving. Fast. Too fast to evade cleanly. Kane pulled hard left. The damaged Hellcat responded sluggishly. Tracer rounds flashed past the canopy. One struck the armored glass directly in front of his face. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer. Cracks spread across the windshield. The Japanese pilot overshot slightly but remained close enough to continue firing. Kane realized something horrifying. He was finally out of options. No altitude, no speed, no engine power, no surprise left. The next attack would probably finish him. Then fate intervened. Far above the battle, American Hellcats from Parker's squadron finally arrived. The first diving attack hit the Japanese formation like a thunderbolt. Machine gun tracers ripped through the sky. One Zero exploded instantly. Another broke away hard to avoid collision. Suddenly, the hunters became the hunted. American fighters screamed into the battle from high altitude with overwhelming speed. Japanese pilots scattered in every direction. Briggs dropped onto Kane's wing almost immediately. The young ensign stared at the damaged Hellcat in disbelief. Oil covered nearly the entire fuselage. The tail looked shredded. Smoke poured continuously from the engine. "How are you still flying?" Briggs asked. Kane didn't answer. Because at that exact moment the engine finally failed. The propeller slowed, coughed once, then stopped completely. Silence flooded the cockpit. After minutes of deafening combat noise, the sudden quiet felt unreal. Only wind remained. Wind and the creaking of damaged metal. Kane was now gliding, thousands of feet above open ocean in a dead aircraft. But at least he was alive. American fighters escorted him back toward the fleet while searching desperately for rescue ships. Below, the Pacific stretched endlessly beneath scattered clouds glowing orange in late afternoon sunlight. Kane calculated glide distance automatically in his head. Still not enough. He wouldn't reach a carrier. The Hellcat was descending too quickly. Finally, Parker's voice returned over radio. "Destroyer group moving into position below you." Kane spotted the ships minutes later. Tiny gray shapes cutting through the ocean at full speed. Crewmen gathered on the decks watching the crippled fighter descend. The final approach felt endless. Without engine power, every movement mattered. Too steep and he would crash violently, too shallow, and he would stall into the sea. The damaged controls barely responded. At 500 feet, Kane lowered the landing. Gear. Nothing happened. Hydraulic. Failure. No gear. No carrier landing possible even if he reached on, so he aimed for the water, the Pacific. Rushed upward beneath him. Then, the Hellcat struck hard. Foam exploded across the canopy. The aircraft skipped once, twice, then slammed nose first into the ocean. Cold seawater burst into the cockpit. Instantly, Kane released his harness and forced the canopy open as the fighter began sinking beneath the surface. For one terrifying moment, he became tangled inside the cockpit. Then he broke free. The ocean swallowed the Hellcat seconds. Later, American sailors pulled him aboard a destroyer less than 10 minutes. Afterward, crewmen stared as Kane climbed onto the deck soaked in oil and seawater. One mechanic later described the aircraft wreckage as barely flyable. Even before the ditching, the damage report shocked everyone. Over 200 bullet and shrapnel holes. Hydraulic. Systems destroyed, fuel leaks, engine failure control. Damage, and yet somehow Kane had survived repeated attacks by superior numbers of Japanese fighters. Not through raw aggression, not through superior firepower, but through timing, observation, and doing the exact opposite of what everyone expected. News of the engagement spread quickly through naval aviation. Circles. Pilots began discussing Kane's maneuver during debriefings. Some dismissed it as desperation, others studied it carefully, because the logic behind it was undeniable. Enemy pilots attacking at high closure speed depended on prediction. Sudden deceleration disrupted everything. Aim, timing, positioning. The maneuver was dangerous, extremely dangerous, but under the right conditions, it created momentary confusion strong enough to reverse a fight. Years later, several Navy instructors referenced similar concepts while teaching advanced energy tactics, not officially, not inside standard manuals, but quietly. Pilot to pilot, veteran to rookie. The story survived because the outcome sounded impossible. A damaged American fighter surrounded by experienced Japanese pilots. An unconventional maneuver repeated against overwhelming odds, and a pilot once mocked as too analytical. Surviving because he understood patterns others ignored. Robert Kane never became a famous war hero. No Hollywood films, no national headlines. After the war, he returned home quietly and worked as an engineer for decades. But among the pilots who heard the story, his reputation changed forever. Not because he destroyed entire squadrons, not because he chased glory, but because at the exact moment every rule failed him, he stopped fighting predictably. And in aerial combat, unpredictability could be more powerful than speed, weapons, or numbers. If you enjoy real World War II stories where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more because sometimes the deadliest move a pilot can make is the one nobody believes would work.